Fire up this puppy.
Welcome to Cross Platform Podcast, where we discuss how to solve productivity problems across platforms. I am Augusto Pinaud,
And I'm Art Gelwicks.
and today we are going to be talking about biometrics and security. This is cybersecurity month, and this is what we're going to discuss. But let's begin with a disclaimer.
Okay, neither Augusto nor I are security experts. We've done things with security, we use security tools, we have our own takes on them. We probably have processes and procedures that are insecure. Matter of fact, I would guarantee that. So,
Many of
we,
them, in my case.
yeah, we will say things that if you're a security expert, you may not agree with. If you don't agree with it, please feel free, comment to us, reach out to us, correct us, and educate us. But don't yell at us. Be nice, because we're just trying to provide helpful insights based on what we've seen over the years. And with the mindset of being cross-platform, with what this show is all about, instead of talking about individual tools or specific things, what I thought we could do is start from the most basic type of security that you can have within your cross-platform system and kind of work our way up the tree in our understandings of it, their pros, their cons, and how it would fit into your world. We're not going to give you a recommendation to say you should use this over that. There are a couple of instances that we may say you really shouldn't do this one thing, but that's based on what has become more of a common understanding as to that's a bad thing to do. So, but with that in mind, if we start at the very bottom of the security pyramid, I would say we start with PIN numbers. And normally we wouldn't think of PIN numbers being like a computer security thing. But just this morning when I walked to my computer and I walked to my desktop and I went to log in, Windows has the option of providing a password or providing a PIN number. And I have a PIN number that I punch in. Why? It's quick. It's easy. And I think we all deal with PIN numbers if in some way, shape, or form, if we do any sort of electronic transaction in a store or at an automatic teller machine or anything like that, it's going to ask you for a PIN number. So what do you think about PIN numbers, Augusto? Do you have any opinion on them?
You know, I begin with a universal PIN number. Okay, my parents had a universal PIN number that they use on everything. So as soon as you learn it, 86, okay, you could basically open everything that has four combination. And as soon as you get seven, you discover, oh, that's what they do when they have 4 digits or 5 digits. So, but yes, it is a problem because PIN numbers, as you said, they're fast, they're convenient, but they're not secure.
No,
Okay,
go
by
ahead.
no means.
Yeah, by no stretch of the imagination. And what your parents did is something that is so extremely common with PIN numbers. And not only PIN numbers, but also passwords. They're
Yeah.
both notorious for this problem of reuse because we only have so much RAM available in our heads to keep track of this stuff. So we start to assign numbers that we know, and we'll use contextual numbers, someone's birthday or an anniversary date or things like that. Well, those numbers can be found out. They can be known. And then you start to use that repetitively. I chuckle every time I think about a PIN number because all I can picture is the scene from the movie Spaceballs where they're opening the air shield and what's the code? 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're like, that's what an idiot would put on their luggage. And of course, the mayor of Spaceball City comes in and that's his luggage code. So pins themselves are very convenient. They're a nice first layer of defense on something that it's not absolutely critical if somebody gets that pin because there's something else backing up that PIN.
Right.
And that's really, when you think about, for example, a financial transaction with a, an ATM card or a debit card, you have to have the physical card and the PIN to make a transaction with that card and that PIN combined. Now, it's different if you're doing like an online transaction because they never ask for the PIN, which they rightfully shouldn't. That's a whole different thing. And I don't want to get into financial security systems because that's a whole show in and of itself. But if we think at the bottom level of PINs, well, that establishes our first rule, which is don't use the same PIN on everything. I mean, that's kind of a common sense thing, but it's something it's worth restating. And when you think about your entire cross-platform, now you have to think about all the places that have pins. Well, am I using the same pin repetitively? So if we kick it up to the next step on the stairwell, now we hit passwords. And passwords are one of those difficult things because it depends on who's enforcing the password as to how you wind up handling that password. I'm not going to ask you for any of them, but when you create passwords for things, what's the process you have in creating a new password for, let's say you sign up for an online service?
Years ago, I switched to the first password manager that I had was even on the Palm Pilot days. So we're talking about many, many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this ability to create passwords. And I decided that I was never in my conscious mind to create a password that complicated. Therefore, that was a better option to whatever I could do. So now I use 1Password and I let them create it. And that allows me to do 15-character password with characters, with things. And that's what created my password. So except the main password, I cannot replicate any of them. And everything lives in the local machine in the 1Password world.
Yeah, I do the
Me.
same thing. I utilize LastPass for mine. I had looked at Bitwarden and a couple others recently, and they definitely have their strengths. But when it comes to the creation of a new password, I allow the password tool to generate specifically for the reason you just outlined. Mm-hmm. The fact I can tell it that I want a 12-character password that includes uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols, and generate one, copy and paste it, and add it into the LastPass system. The only password that was not automatically generated that way is my master password into LastPass. And the reason being is very simple. That's one I have to be able to remember. It can't be just a random series of characters and symbols. It has to be something that cognitively I can keep in my head. Now, yeah, in theory, I could write it down and put it in a box. That's fine. Same difference. But the real core of it is that passwords can be very robust. They can be solid. I mean, you think about most cases, passwords fall apart when you do exactly what we just described with pins. You use the same password in multiple places. Or, and this is something I'm sure you've seen, Augusto, when you get into an environment that's forcing you to change your password on an interval, so for example, every 30 days, you need a new password. Well, for that to work and work well, you have to add additional rules to it. Like you can't use a similar password to one that you've used before in X amount of time. Otherwise, you'll have like password A, and then the next one you'll be used is password B, and so on. So all of those rule sets wind up getting superimposed on top of the password you create. And now you're starting to go, well, wait, how do I create one that fits within these rules? What was my old one? How do I... And it's part of the solid pushback that passwords often have, especially in not only in personal environments, but in corporate environments where the password integrity is really important. I mean, I think about it this way. How likely of a target is the system that is protected by the security item or a security system that you're putting in place? And if it's a very likely target, like online banking, for example, then yeah, there's absolutely a reason to have very robust layers. If it's a system that, it's a flash drive, it's your personal flash drive, and it sits in a box, there's probably no real reason for heavy secured encryption, for example, on it. But there might be. I don't want to tell anybody one way or the other, not knowing what the content is. So with passwords, what's your recommendation if somebody says, well, I need to come up with passwords, but I don't want to use a password tool? What would be your suggestions or recommendations to them?
Well, the first I will argue why. Why not? Why you don't want to use those? And the reality is you need to keep, in order to be able to create a secure password, 12 or plus characters, numbers, capital letters, lower cap, you need to be able to write them down. So where are you going to write them down? Are you going to put them in a place where they can be accessible? And that is part of the problem with the security. And that's why, people tend to remember their passwords on their Chrome, on the Chrome browser, or the
Mm-hmm.
Safari, or their Mac. And it is a bad call. It is a bad news. And sadly, it's what we see. But that doesn't make it a better call because of that. And I wish to have a way to help people to get better passwords.
Yeah, there's no question password integrity is probably one of the biggest weaknesses of any password based system,
Hmm.
because either we maintain a password for too long because we remember it, and then it becomes exposed in some way, shape, or form, or we make them too simple so that we can recall them and not have to worry about storing them.
Right.
It's just there is no good way in my mind for passwords to really be treated as a secured layer. It has to be part of something else. And this is where we start to dig into things that are newer technology, relatively newer technologies, especially when compared to things like pins and passwords, where you get into things like fingerprint readers. Fingerprint readers are pretty much the standard anymore on most higher end mobile devices. They'll have an underscreen fingerprint reader, or one on the side, or one on the back, something that you can go through and program based on your fingerprints. And do you use anything that has fingerprint readers, Augusto?
I do, and I begin that on the iPhones. That was the first ones, I think. Um, so the fingerprint reader on the iPhone was of iPads were the first one before they even introduced FaceTime and it's um, Face
Mm-hmm.
ID and stuff. So that's where I began using them. Yes.
Now, let me ask you an interesting question that kind of jumped out at me. I use the fingerprint reader on my phone constantly. That's a primary secure method for me. Um, do you have one fingerprint stored in yours, or do you have more than one fingerprint?
I have more than one
Okay. Why did you put more than one in? I'm curious.
because of the angle on which you use
There
the
you go.
device. You will use one finger or the other. Yeah.
There you go.
Actually, I can tell you that I have my fingerprint register on my wife and kids' devices. Okay,
Oh,
sometimes
really?
I pick the wrong finger to do that, but yes.
I didn't even think about that. But that's an excellent backup way of going through that. I actually have multiple fingers programmed on mine exactly for what you described. Whichever hand you're holding it in, whatever you
Hmm.
commonly use it with. Um, I also have I have a scar on my one finger from when I burned it years ago that fouls up my fingerprint on my one index finger, and it will not read on any fingerprint reader. No matter what I do,
Ooh,
it won't read it as a fingerprint, no matter how hard I've tried. So I can't use that one as part of a fingerprint reader. I have to
right.
choose an alternative finger. So those are things that when we think about the fingerprint readers, When you set that up on an Apple device, when I set it up on a Samsung device, I have to have a pin already on that device, and then I'm allowed to set up a fingerprint. It's that,
I think that's the same principle when you go to Apple
and
Yeah.
this is where I think when we think about this cross-platform, this becomes very important because now we're talking about layers of security, and my tablet doesn't have a fingerprint reader in it, so it always uses a pin. My tablet and my phone use the same pin. Should they? Probably not if I wanted them to be truly secure. But
Correct.
the odds of them being separated by too much of a distance is kind of limited. That said, this is one of those things that we have to take into consideration is, for example, on your phone, if you use, now let me say on mine, on my Samsung, if the phone is shut down and then restarted, the fingerprint reader's disabled. I have to enter the PIN on the first restart before it will re-enable the fingerprint reader. And that's a security reason, which I think is very useful and it's very convenient. I like the fingerprint readers. I've been a fan of them for a long time. I've used them on a number of different devices, and I actually have a fingerprint reader on my laptop that I use frequently because all I have to do is just run my finger over it and my laptop's unlocked. It's very convenient. And I know it's tied into everything. And that laptop doesn't have a pin. The laptop has my full password. So I know it's 2 layers of fairly solid security to be able to protect the contents of that laptop.
Right. My laptop do not have that. My laptop, I don't use a lot the laptop. But the laptop has a password, and it also has the watch. So if the watch is unlocked and closed in a certain time frame, the watch will unlock the laptop.
Yeah, that's another layer that I want to get into with this. And we can dig into it now rather than getting into the next one. Secondary devices. Multiple parts to the puzzle. In the pre-show, you and I were talking about how it's very similar to a lot of the newer cars that have the keyless fobs that you can get into the car and literally just climb into the car and push a start button and the car starts. And the only reason why that works is because the keyless fob is in the proximity of that vehicle.
Right.
Well, it's the same thing that we're talking about here. For example, my smartwatch is connected to my phone, and my phone is set up so that it knows if it can see my smartwatch, it doesn't need to be locked. It can be unlocked because it knows that I'm within proximity of it somehow. That, for me, is a very convenient thing. Now, it's something I can disable any given time. But from a convenience standpoint, that's very useful. So when we think about these types of systems and these types of layers of security, you can see right away what happens. We're having to design a system, a cross-platform solution that not only provides us the layers of security around our devices, but it also provides us the convenience of still being able to use said devices.
Correct.
So the next layer that comes up is Face ID. Now, do you use Face ID on Apple?
I do, and I love it actually.
Okay.
It's if I thought that the finger was cool, the Face ID it's even better.
I've had 3 devices over the years that have used Face ID. I've never really used it on Apple because I stopped using Apple devices heavily before that became a core part of their functionality. I have had moderate success with Face ID or the equivalent on Google Pixel. The 4XL had I forget the name of it, but it's the short-range radar system to actually read your face. And its unlock was very good. It was very quick. I have not had the same level of success with the Samsung device. I have had, again, moderate success with Windows, because Windows has Windows Hello, and certain systems it can do the face recognition. So, do you have any concerns about Face ID?
And this is where my lack of um, security expert will come. No, the answer is no. I trust the Face ID as a security measurement. Is perfect? No, it is not, but it's better than me having 1234 as a password.
Right. And that I think is really what this all comes back to is it's not so much what does the device do when you have it. It's what does it do when you don't have it? When someone else picks it up. What is the behavior? How do the layers of protection kick into play? I remember distinctly in the Google setup for its Face ID having options such as requiring your eyes to be open, what they call the blink register,
Right.
so that you couldn't just hold up a photograph. Having to do that encoding, that initial setup, with and without your glasses, so that it could see the difference and build that image model up.
See, I don't remember Apple doing the with and without the glasses ever, to be honest with you.
It may not have needed it. I think this was very much something that was a limitation in the technology they were using to do that authentication, that registration. In current, the past 18, 20 months that we've been through, I know masks have played havoc with Face ID in many cases.
Yes, and actually you cannot register Face ID with a mask, wearing a mask. So
Right,
I have
and
tried.
that's one of those things. Now, allegedly, if I recall correctly, I think the new iPhones are supposed to be smart enough to be able to work with a mask. I don't remember,
Yes,
but
well, no. If you have your watch,
okay,
you have the latest operating system and your watch. What the Apple do is they recognize you have a mask, and then go to, okay, if you have a mask, do you have your watch unlocked with you right now? And if it's yes, then unlock the phone.
okay. Yeah, see, that's the type of thing where when you look at every part of this cross-platform puzzle, you have to recognize that every device in it has to have its own security layer to integrate in with all the other security layers.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go back to the example of using my watch to unlock my phone. That's great, but my watch is smart enough that if I take my watch off and then put it back on, it won't allow me to use it unless I give it back the pin that I have set up on the
Correct.
watch. And that's specifically because I have it set up to allow for touchless payments. So I use Samsung Pay through the watch. So it requires that additional layer of protection. If I didn't have that, that would introduce a weakness, a chink in the armor, so to say, for the security structure that I have set up here. So all of these things that we've talked about so far have been that kind of first level of defense. When somebody's going into a system, whether it's your password on a device, maybe your password getting into the Dropbox or the cloud or on your phone or your tablet, those are all the first initial protection layers. But one of the things that we've had over the past several years is a thing called 2FA, which is two-factor authentication. And if you're not familiar with two-factor authentication, you may actually have encountered it and
Oh, I'm
just
sure. Most
didn't
people
know
do.
it. Yeah.
Correct.
So let's go back to a banking situation. Often you'll sign up or go to sign into an online banking account, and some banks will say, we're going to send you a text message with a code. You have to enter that code in to be able to pass through. And what they're doing is they're using your device as that second factor of authentication, basically making the assumption that only you have this given device, therefore you will receive the message and therefore provide the code, and we can let you in with a reasonable sense of confidence that you are who you say you are. And for the most part, that works fine. I I have issues with that process in a lot of cases because of complications in the process, but also because of poor implementations as well. And before we start to really talk about the 2FA part, any system that says, hey, we're going to email you a code and then you're going to enter that code in to validate, that's not two-factor authentication. Do not consider that in my book. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't consider receiving a secondary security code at an email address as a layer of security.
Of security.
It's like 1.5 in my book. It's too easy to get access to that. It's too easy to pay. We're not talking about encrypted email or anything like that. So,
and that is the problem. That email, that communication, yeah, it give an obstacle, but it's just that. It's an obstacle because there is no security between that number and how that number comes there. If I break into your machine and I get there, most likely I'm already on your machine. I can access your email. There is really no extra security in that.
Right. And that's where I think that we have to be careful, because something that looks like it's an extra security factor often is not. There's an old term, security by obscurity. If it's hard to get to, it's more secure. But that's not the case at all.
Correct.
One of the other, this is kind of a side topic, but any site or any tool that's asking you, quote, security questions, and those security questions are from like a drop-down list of security, what was your favorite pet? What was your favorite sports team? Things like that. No, those don't count as security in any way, by no way, shape, or form. Just a piece of advice I give to everybody: if you're using a site and they start to give you those kinds of questions, pick whatever questions you want and give answers that have nothing to do with the questions. You're going to have to remember that. You're going to have to write them down somewhere. That's fine. But they should be totally unrelated to the questions themselves. You cannot give out that kind of information because it is a vulnerability. If you answer someplace, what was your mother's maiden name? Do you know how many places use that as a validation check? You don't want to be handing that stuff out just, willy-nilly. But back to where we were headed with this. So with two-factor authentication, there is that confirmation based on a registered device that you are who you say you are. And there's two normal ways that you'll get a two-factor authentication notice. You'll either get it by text message, or you'll get it through an app that you have to install. Okay, let's get this one right on the table right away. Text message is bad. Let's be clear about that. Any system that's using SMS as two-factor authentication is not secure. I'll say that bluntly. Primarily because phone numbers can be spoofed. Phones can be spoofed.
Actually, I believe the SMS, I prefer you send me the email that we just discussed, I don't consider secure, than the SMS. I think the SMS is even worse.
Yeah, it's a horrific mess. And when you look at, it gets even worse. You look at some apps that will actually go through and say, oh, okay, we're going to send you an authentication code through SMS. And then many times the app will be waiting for that text message to come in, grab that code and pop it in and say, yep, you are who you say you are, without even allowing you to intervene in that step process. Again, that's just not a good way to do it. So the better option is using two-factor authentication applications, authenticators. I actually have 3 different authenticators installed just because I wanted to see what they look like. I don't.
What do you have? Now I'm curious. What do you have? I have 2.
I have the Google Authenticator.
Okay.
I have the LastPass Authenticator.
I don't have that one.
And I have the Microsoft Authenticator.
Microsoft,
And I had them specifically just because I wanted to be able to see what the experience was like with them. I primarily use the LastPass, but I have the Microsoft one set up as the Microsoft Authenticator for Microsoft services. And they do work a little differently. They receive their notifications, they receive their functions. But what frequently you'll have, if with these apps, there's two ways they'll work. They'll either receive a notification that says, hey, somebody's trying to log into this account, prove, either accept or reject that this is an authenticated access attempt, and you can say accept or reject, and then it passes it on through, which works kind of nice. Matter of fact, it works so nice that, for example, with LastPass on mine, it not only sends it to the phone, but that then gets passed to my watch. So I can approve or reject the request.
Yeah, same as a Microsoft.
Which is a wonderful thing. Let me just tell you, when the few days I had when I got my new watch and I didn't have everything configured, I had forgotten how nice that particular feature is. Because otherwise, you got to go get your phone. If your phone's in another room, you're not signing in until you go get that device. Which is one of the big weaknesses of this is, again, single point of failure. But we'll talk about that more in a bit. But the other option you have is something very similar to what you have in corporate spaces, where there's a code number generated. There's actually, in many cases, it's usually 6 digits, could be more, but it's constantly being generated. And the authenticator is tied to the service, and there's actually a series of steps where you tie to, for example, for Microsoft or whatever, you tie to the online system. You identify that you're using a 2FA app. There's usually a QR code involved somewhere in the process. And then at that point, that number is continuously updated, and it'll ask you to provide the code for that service. And whatever the code is at that time, you plug it in, and then it validates that, oh, yep, that's the code number you should have based on this date and time and phase of the moon and whatever they're using from, for the magical generation of those numbers.
It is interesting. As you are describing that, you make me think, no, I have two more because I have an electronic token.
Yes, so do I.
I have an RSA electronic token, and I have another one for a client that is a card. They don't have an electronic token, but it's a card, and they give you two numbers. And you need to figure out what are the numbers combination based on the card.
That's interesting. I hadn't seen that before. I use the RSA tokens. I have a hard token for a client. I've worked with clients that use soft tokens. They actually, matter of fact, I have one. It's an app on the phone that's generating it.
Yeah,
but that's the only thing. But it's a dedicated soft token for that particular service.
Correct.
It doesn't cover multiple services. That to me is a much more secure layer because it's limited to that device. That becomes your keys to your car. That said,
Apple, when you log into the iCloud account, or you are trying to make changes, it sends it to every device, and you need to authorize and put a code. So that also helps, because if you don't have any device, if you took my iPad and tried to, you need to have at least another device that is showing you the code to be able to solve that problem. So it's not perfect, but it's not terrible.
And that's really the case. It's not perfect. It's not a system that's going to be 100% bulletproof.
No, it's not.
But it is a way to provide that extra layer of security within the environment. My only thing that always makes me nervous about, especially since my phone is the hub of almost all of this stuff, is when I change devices. So if I go out and I get a new phone, there's a point where I have to transition all of that 2FA stuff over from one to the other. I've had in the past situations where I've somehow managed to goof up the process or forget to transition one thing over. And then it starts to go, okay, let me go check with that device. Well, I don't have that device anymore. Now I have a significant problem. And I've seen this happen further down the chain than just the 2FA devices.
Yep.
I've seen, for example, most recently, when my stepfather-in-law passed away, we needed to get it into his email account to close it out and take care of that stuff and follow up with some people he knew. We didn't have his password because he hadn't written it down anywhere. He had just remembered it. So we had to go and ask for a password reset. Well, the way the system was set up was to send an SMS based authentication code to his phone
Hmm.
to type in. We didn't have his phone anymore. We had already shut it down and turned it back in.
And actually, that is one thing that I'm going to make a pause. And if you go into that circumstance,
Mm-hmm.
do not, the cell phone is the last
Yes.
thing you should cancel because it is the major hub for most people. And it's sadly the first thing that we cancel because
Yeah,
it's
I
easy.
I didn't even think about that
No, most people don't. Most
recently,
people don't.
and it's unfortunate because I had gone through that with my own father 3+ years ago now, and it didn't even occur to me that that's something that you should hang on until the absolute last minute, because again, you're right. That's going to be that set of keys that is tied to all of these other systems, in most cases, not in all, but in
No, no, no,
most.
but it must, yeah.
And it's an important step that we have to take with this. But when we look at the process involved, most of the services, and this is something to look at with whatever service you're deciding on to take care of this for you, is what is their process of changing from device to device? How do you back up your two-factor authentication information so that you're not locked out of everything? LastPass has a very comprehensive, although slightly cumbersome, method of being able to back up your two-factor authentication main passwords and transition from one device to another. The transition from device to device is actually pretty easy with LastPass, but it does require planning ahead and taking some steps ahead. And if you're not technologically comfortable, this can feel a little challenging. It can be a little concerning. You can lock yourself
Well,
out of stuff. It is
yeah.
doable.
And actually, you made a good point. That is something that we have done, and is my master password for one password is on the hands of a third party, right? Somebody who I trust who has an envelope with that password. In case something happened, that person has the login to the 6 digit to my phone and the password to that,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't tend to think on those things. But do you know, you may not know what is the 4 pin to unlock that. And now if you lock that phone or you lock that device, now you are in bigger problems than what you were before.
And it brings up probably one of the most important factors of this, aside from protecting your information and things like that, is what happens when it's not your information anymore.
Hmm.
We're both talking about the same circumstance within, for example, LastPass, which I use. They have part of their service where I can identify an individual from a different email address who could email in and request access to my LastPass passwords.
Okay.
If that request comes in, I get notified and I can approve it or reject it. But I also there's a setting on it that says if you don't do anything with this request within X number of days, it will grant that person access.
Right.
So by default, I think mine set it like 30 days or something like that.
Your wife is going to hate you, just for the record.
Yeah, well, actually, I need to check. I don't know how long it's set. Now, it may not be that long. I
See,
think
if it's
it may
30
be
days,
shorter.
if it's 30 days, you're going to be cursed until the day 31.
Yeah, that actually brings a good point. I may have to change that time interval. Now that I think about it, but at least there's that safety valve there.
Well,
But
but that's what is important on this part of the conversation. I get the topic is topic we people tend to avoid, but it's important to discuss what is going to happen with, what is going to happen when, who is the
absolutely,
person, and as you mentioned, parents and your dad, and you mentioned your stepdad in law, okay, who have those passwords? if something happened, who can access to any of that? Because it's a problem.
It is. And we think about basic things protected behind these layers of security. But for example, going through and if you need to turn off a bunch of accounts, monthly subscriptions. I mean, you could be talking, a couple $100s a month in monthly subscriptions that are all underneath one particular email address with who knows what password. Well, if you don't have that, that's a real burden to put on the people who, have to deal with this after you don't. So when we think about our security structures and we think about how does this cross, this is the one time that other people need to be considered part of your platform. Almost always, we talk about sharing information and that those are factors. This is a really important part of it. So there are some things, and as we start to get to the outer edge of this conversation, there are some things that I have found in certain apps that I really like, features that I think people should look for. And I would be curious on the Apple side if there's anything similar to what I'm going to describe or some of these functions. Two of them that come to mind is within my phone, there's what's called lockout mode that can be enabled. And what lockout mode does is if instead of turning the phone off, I can go through the process of turning it off. It will pop up a screen that gives me an option to either power the device off. I think I can do an emergency call right from there as well. But if I hit lockout mode, it immediately disables all the biometrics. So Face ID, fingerprint ID are now disabled on that device until I completely authenticate myself back into it using either my PIN or my password. It's a very, I don't want to say it's a nice feature, but it's one that provides some comfort. Because there's always concerns of, well, if somebody just holds their phone up, your phone up to your face while you're sleeping, they could unlock it. Or if they put your finger on it without, coerce, they could unlock it. And yeah, it's no different than somebody making you stick your front door key in your house and walking in your house. So being able to have that feature, I like that feature quite a bit. And I have that feature actually enabled. Never had to use it, hopefully never will. But it is a capability to kind of push or move the goalposts
Right.
on the ease of access. The second one, and this is one that is more device specific, is when it comes to security, Samsung's have this, they have a big thing, Samsung Knox, which is their on-device encryption storage. It's kind of like Fort Knox. That's the takeoff on it.
Right.
But there's a secured section isolated in the phone that is fully encrypted, that is behind a separate password and separate fingerprint IDs. So it doesn't even use you have to actually re-register the fingerprint IDs to be able to get into that section. So in theory, you could use different fingers if you really wanted to. But that provides a second place to be able to store sensitive things that you wouldn't want to store in other places. I mean, if you want to be able to carry around, if you're not using something that's an encrypted cloud-based service, and you wanted to be able to carry things around, such as maybe a photo of your passport and a photo of your birth certificate and a photo of your your COVID ID card, you wanted to have all those in there. You could then store it in that encrypted area and have that extra layer of protection. Even if you were to lose your device, that stuff would not be accessible. It's important to take that into consideration. The other thing, and this is the third thing, and then I'm curious to hear what comes to mind for you, Augusto, is the ability to remote wipe devices. Primarily mobile devices. I know my Samsung has the ability, Android pretty much across the board has the ability to do a remote wipe. So I can say, look, you know what? I don't have control over this device anymore. Wipe it out. There's a setting in there that allows me to say, if somebody tries to punch into this X number of times, if they try to get past my PIN more than 10 times, for example, in a row,
Right.
it will wipe the device. Just burn it down. That I have turned on as well.
Me
I'll
too.
admit, when I fat finger the pin 5 times in a row, I start to break out a little bit of sweat. I'll admit that stress starts to creep in. But it's another factor that has to be included. And it's important when we look at all these pieces tied together, because that's my primary set of authentication keys for all these two-factor systems. If that's out of my control, I can't have it exist anymore. It needs to completely go away. So, what do you have on your side of the fence that you've seen
Yeah,
that you
we
like?
have, well, with the Apple devices, you have the Find My Phone. You can lock the phones remotely. You can put, hey, this is my phone, it's lost. This is a number, you can contact me. You can change the password. Um, that actually, I'm going to say, as a parent of a small kids, is great. Oh, you don't want to do it? No problem. I go to Find My Phone, lock the device, and you require a new password to do it. So, um, those things, and you can find out where the device is. That said, I don't think I have ever, knock on wood, needed to wipe out a device. So I have not considered that, to be honest. Shame on me.
I've actually had to wipe a device remotely one time. And it was a device that was in a backpack, and the backpack was stolen. And even with find your device, sometimes you're just not going to get close enough, and it's not going to work. I wasn't able to recover the device, and did a remote wipe of it, locked out the device itself. I knew at least the information that I had on there was now safe because it was gone, but the device was still a device. Now, if I recall correctly, and I probably am wrong on this, doesn't Apple, if you report a device stolen, won't they lock out the device from being reactivated?
They lock the MEI
Okay.
number, so you cannot register on another network. But I don't know about the blocking the device.
Okay.
But
So,
I am um, logging in as of right now. Okay, I can remove devices. I can.
yeah, I'm looking at mine right now because you kind of piqued my interest a little bit. I can lock it out, but there's also a function on this now for Find My Device on Android where I can secure the device remotely. And by securing the device, it allows me to put a message on the lock screen, add in a phone number, which I find kind of ironic because if this is my only phone number, I don't know what I'm putting on there. That was one of
Yeah,
the things I did.
on the iPad, on any device, I can. It's probably not going to
Right.
see it, but I can technically erase the device. So I will be able to click erase device, and it will do it remotely. I'm not going to play or test it, but
Yeah,
technically you can.
the only thing this won't do, yeah, it won't allow me to erase the device I'm using this from, so it would be from someplace else. But the other nice thing is you can do it from the web as well. So that's very
You can do
useful.
it from the web too, and yes, yeah.
So so there's definitely, and this gets more into not so much specific device security, but now you're starting to look into other things like tracking tokens, things like Tile and the Samsung tags or or Apple Air tags and things like that. From a security standpoint of being able to track your physical assets, those become very useful. Again, you've got layers of security that have to come into play. Something like a Find My Phone is great. As a parent, we've used it. But there's a point where I can't use Find My Phone, or at least I shouldn't be using Find My Phone to, say, locate my wife's phone, unless she has given me the information, because there's a password layer there, as well it should be. So there's all that give and take that comes into play. But when and kind of bring this full circle, when we think about security and we think about biometrics and we make this part of our cross platform environment, we have to think about what is the information and what are the walls that it needs to be behind. Once we've done that, the last step is then figure out how do you get through all those walls, and
Hmm.
are we comfortable that that is secure enough that we are willing to use that? Because if you're in a constant state of I'm not sure, I'm worried that somebody's going to, you're never going to use it. You
Correct.
won't use it, and then you go from there. We were talking very briefly at the beginning of the show about this concept called air gapping. And air gapping is a technology term, if you're not familiar with it, where you have a device that has no connection to the internet whatsoever. It is physically and wirelessly and separate from any external devices. So if you think about back in the day when you'd have a computer, if you unplugged the modem, you were pretty much air gapped. Unless you had a
Yeah.
network card in it, you were isolated. Now it's much more difficult because so many devices live off of their wireless connection. So being able to isolate something down to quote an air gapped level, well, you just have to think about what you're putting on there and how you're working with it. We didn't dig into a lot of things like encryption and different forms of encryption and things like that, whether it's wireless encryption, whether it's actually on device storage encryption. But those are all factors that need to come into play when you think about securing your information within your environment. How protected is it? And we can back this out even further. I get a question very often around OneNote. People will ask, hey, how secure is OneNote?
Hmm.
My answer is pretty common. It's as secure as you want to make it because it's all depending on the layers of security that somebody has to go through to get into it. Now, there is one additional layer within it. You can actually assign passcodes to sections within OneNote folders. The advantage of those are they are separate passcodes from the folder itself. So it's a secured layer in
Oh,
there.
that's nice.
It is. And it's even nicer that they are unrecoverable. Microsoft says flat out, you forget the password, we can't do anything for you. So that to me it's a nice aspect of it to be able to provide that additional layer. But again, this is part of this consideration as you define all of these different things. Your security model that you're putting into place has to be a core part of defining this cross-platform environment. Do you have anything else you want to call out for people or
You
advice
know,
you want to
I
give
was
them on?
thinking, what else I have, and I was thinking about, again, like you, I work with clients, and sometimes, hey, I have their devices, and I have seen, from the corporation who you can only use that device and almost
Mhm.
need to go like that movie. What was the name of that movie? Gattaca, I think what it was.
Oh
You
yeah.
need to put the blood.
Yep. Yep.
And I work from those that you almost need to put the blood sample and that you need to wait for
Mm-hmm.
them to analyze it, to the ones that password. What is that? Okay, and dealing with, hey, little kids, okay, who have devices, who are connected, who contain information that they don't understand. Why did you want me to have a password? And teach them, no, 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 you, all your passwords cannot be 1 2 3 4. You need to change them, you need to vary them, and have all those complications. Aging parents who don't necessarily understand the implications of their passwords, or then in the case of my father, he goes then to the opposite extreme, but then he cannot remember the passwords. So
Yeah.
he make this thing incredibly complicated and secure, but then he don't remember the password. So all those challenges, and yes, as some of these things, the fingerprint, the face ID are incredible and useful, you need to think on, or try to think on, everything else. What are the passwords you have? What are the things? Because one of the things we don't think, as you mentioned it, when you talk about the security questions. Okay, if you always pick the same four security questions and you give the
Mm-hmm.
actual answer, there is no security questions anymore.
Oh, absolutely. And It's unfortunate because we start to gravitate towards those questions that are easy to answer,
Hmm.
that we can recall, but sometimes we'll even foul those questions up. You'll have a text box that's case sensitive, and then all of a sudden you've put it in one way versus the other. Now you try to go back and authenticate it
And
and it
now
says,
you're in
oh, that's
trouble.
not the right one. The other thing that when you have a system that's providing you those kinds of drop down prompts, the only ways I have seen that done even remotely well is when it asks, the system will say, provide a security question and provide an answer. Provide another
Mm.
security question. So you're providing your own questions. That's
Yeah,
very rare, but it's
but
much
that's
more
very
effective.
rare. Yeah.
So that's why
The,
I recommend,
because one of the problems with this thing is the average user tend to be more annoyed by these security concepts
exactly.
than understanding the implications and the use. Even with all the hacking, even with all these things, still the users tend to be more annoyed than
Mm-hmm.
happy.
One last thing I wanted to call out is, and again, this is not, I'm not specifically recommending LastPass, it just happens to be the tool I use. They have a function within their paid environment, and as always, I do recommend if you like software, pay for it, support your devs, is they have a security dashboard that looks at the consolidated password and account information that you have stored within your LastPass account. And it does things like, when was the last time you changed this password?
Mm-hmm.
How complex is the password on this? And gives you an overall security assessment,
Yeah.
allows you to go through and identify passwords that need to be updated or changed or too easy, or you may have used the same password multiple places and didn't even realize it.
Yeah,
It
one
also,
password catch that too, and it gives you a list of really passwords that are related to you that has been, broken,
right,
and it's telling you, hey, if you have ever used this password 1234, it's been on one of the passwords that has been open in the market. Change it.
right. And that's where I was getting to with this is it has the dark web monitoring. That's fine. But what it does is identifies breached sites. They're like, oh, okay. So you'll get notifications say, oh, this particular site was breached. You're going to want to change your password on there. Even if it hasn't affected you, it's
You
still
should.
it's another way of just taking control over this part of the experience. And we have to do that. We think about security often like we think about our house keys. The only time they're really a concern is when we forgot them. Otherwise, they're just there. We're going to assume they're going to work in the lock every time and we're going to be fine. But when those keys start to wear out or we have to change the locks on the house or, anything like that, then it becomes a bigger effort. So if you can do a little bit of preventative maintenance in the beginning and
Yeah.
integrating this as part of your system, you're in
No,
much better
no. When
condition.
we moved to this house at the beginning of the pandemic, we got a bag of keys.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm like, what is this? Well, we don't know. It was from the original owner passed to the new owner, and then the new owner passed it to the owner we bought the house for, and then we got this. It was like, what? What
So,
do you want me
so
to do with this?
like we were talking about earlier, think about,
Wipe out the passwords. That's what we did. Change all the
well, and that's if we
and
think
put
about
them in the trash.
if we think about a situation where all of that stuff has to get handed to someone and you're not there to oversee
Mhm.
it, it's like handing them a big Ziploc baggie of
Right.
keys. Are the keys even labeled? Do you even know
Yeah.
where they go? Do you know what lock they tie to? And that's in many cases they don't. So it's worth spending time doing an assessment and just doing a map for yourself as to all the important accounts that you have and how are they protected. You don't
Mhm.
even have to write that information down. Just say this one has a password, this one has a pin and a password, this one has such and such and such and such, and you can get a sense as to, well, wait, this is really important and this is all it's got. Maybe I need to see if I A, don't have something turned on, which is often the
Right.
case, or B, maybe I got to look at some other service. I got to find an alternative because if this is the way they handle security, this could be a problem for me.
Yep.
So, yep, security,
But
it's a thing.
it's a thing, and well, we hope you keep paying attention to it, and check on yours and improve of yours. So follow us where you like to listen podcast, subscribe, leave us a review. You can also interact with us in PersonalProductivity.club. We are Augusto Pinaud and Art Gelwicks, and see you next time from your favorite device.